Ten Hag might be scapegoated. We certainly can't say he's safe at this point. Still, the reasoning behind changing a manager is not going to be as rash as maybe in seasons gone by.
Erik Ten Hag is facing an uncertain summer following a campaign that has presented a horror show at Selhurst Park. But is it all as clear-cut as many of your popular social media accounts would have you think? Well, we're diving into the Dutchman's future, as well as a best-in-class setup that will oversee a badly needed summer transfer window. So sit back and enjoy. It's here, your first episode of the Theatre of Red. In what is the very first episode of something that I have been looking forward to for a very, very long time, I am delighted to welcome you to the official Theatre of Red podcast. Now, as this is a first, it was necessary to invite an individual befitting of the occasion. And with that, I am thrilled to welcome Mr. Ben Jacobs as my guest. Ben, you and I have spoken before, but it is an absolute pleasure to share time with you today. How is everything with what must be a very, very happy Leicester City supporter?
Well, it's great to be here and thank you for having me. But what I would say is if you're starting a brand new podcast and I'm the number one guest on it, there's pressure. So I was doing okay until you said that. I suppose you can only improve from here, starting with me and upwards and onwards from there. But as a Leicester fan, delighted. And it's going to be a interesting season back in the Premier League because coming back up first time, brilliant for Leicester, but there is that financial difficulties hovering over us. So fingers crossed from here, I suppose, that the club can keep on to Kearn and Dewsbury Hall, a Manchester United target, and that we start with 0 points, not minus whatever. That's another consideration at the back of my mind ahead of next season.
Never a quiet day in football. Beginning with what has to be the elephant in this conversation and the fallout from what was a utterly horrific Premier League trip to Selhurst Park for Manchester United. Erik Ten Hag's injury-ravaged side looked but a shadow of themselves in the face of a 4-0 Crystal Palace thumping, leading to a variety of sharpened knives that were already there waiting for our Dutch chief. I know that you have spent ample time discussing the future of Ten Hag and any would-be successor, but I would like to hear firsthand about any information that you have regarding Thomas Tuchel and his desire to manage Manchester United and a rebirth back in the Premier League, and whether or not word has filtered through about any sort of a managerial decision by Sir Jim Ratcliffe and co.
Yeah, before we get on to Thomas Tuchel, I think I would like to point out that Manchester United are not so much a project at the moment as a pre-project. And only really when we get into the summer, Jason Wilcox beds in, Omar Barada arrives, Dan Ashworth compensation is finalised and he comes into the club. Only at that point will we start to see the true impact. And of course, Sir Dave Brailsford's done this strategic review. Jean-Claude Blanc is interim CEO. So there's best-in-class people at the moment that are implementing a lot of the strategy that started to formulate before the acquisition and continued for the 60 to 100 days after it. But we won't really see the impact of this project until during the summer, after the summer, and maybe in the next 1 to 3 years. It depends what criteria you're judging it by. If you're looking at Ten Hag, we might well see either a commitment to him or an instant change very quickly. Whereas if you're talking obviously about the stadium, it's going to take a bit more time. But either way, this is not Chelsea, who are now 2 years into their project. It's not Tottenham, who have had Postecoglou for a year. It's not Newcastle, who have had PIF for even longer, but are waiting for the point where financially they can finally flex. So the first task at Manchester United is about building a strategy and then, in likelihood, as we're already seeing, a new culture. And this is why Jim Ratcliffe wants staff coming back to work and not being hybrid. And then from there, it will filter down from the top. And that's the big change to understand, that Manchester United in seasons gone by had dressing rooms that had power. And every time there was a problem post Sir Alex Ferguson, the manager got scapegoated. And Ten Hag might be scapegoated. We certainly can't say he's safe at this point, especially not after the Selhurst Park humbling, as you put it. But still, the reasoning behind changing a manager is not going to be as rash as maybe in seasons gone by, post Sir Alex Ferguson. And that's ultimately why Ten Hag's going to get the FA Cup final until the end of the season. And there may be internal things that lead Manchester United to realise why he's hampered. Or they may say, there's another manager out there that's better to lead this project forwards. And as Thomas Tuchel found at Chelsea, it can be quite difficult when you jump from one project to another project and one strategy to another strategy. It can be quite difficult at times if you're the incumbent, because you've done it one way under one regime. And even though the Glazers are still there, it's obvious that Ineos people are now calling all the shots. And making a fresh change can often help make a clean break. And you can handpick who you want rather than who you've inherited. And that's going against Ten Hag. Going in his favour is, I think, everyone connected with Sir Jim Ratcliffe realises the challenges and the issues and the culture and the lack of communication and the manner in which data isn't connected and the injuries. So they're trying to work out what the root cause is and then judge the manager. And maybe people from afar will sort of say it's still going to end up the same way, because if results aren't coming, the manager doesn't last. But at least he's going to get a full season to either get Ineos on board with him or ultimately change their mind about him. And if he can't, then he goes. And results like Selhurst Park obviously don't help, even though Ten Hag may argue there's mitigating circumstances, particularly injuries and the fact that Casemiro was having to play as a defender. So with all of that, and now coming back to your question, Manchester United have been succession planning. And succession planning is not the same as interviewing or having an open vacancy. Succession planning is what well-run clubs do when they might have to make a change. So there's not managerial limbo. Brighton are succession planning. They want to keep De Zerbi, but if he goes, they need options. Chelsea are succession planning. They want it to work with Pochettino, but they'll review him much like Ten Hag at the end of the season. And if it doesn't work, you don't want to be clutching at straws. So you need a plan for your manager staying and a plan for your manager going. And that's why we hear so many names linked. Now, succession planning, to be a bit more specific, means running data on candidates, finding out if they're interested, finding out what you might have to pay them and how, in some cases, you might need to get them out of their existing contracts, and then internally discussing how you would rank those names. So if you do go into the market, you've done the legwork. And that's kind of what Manchester United are doing. But it isn't necessarily the biggest clue in the world that a change is definitively going to be made. But where there are clues are Coventry being able to come back and get on level terms, even though Manchester United went through in that semi-final, or the Selhurst Park game. Those are clues because players seem to have dropped their heads, and Ten Hag hasn't been able to get the best out of a squad that may ultimately end up finishing out of a European place. And with Arsenal to come and Newcastle to come, obviously all that will be factored in. Then with Thomas Tuchel, there's no doubt whatsoever amongst the names that might be in the mix for Manchester United that Thomas Tuchel would welcome an approach from Manchester United. He feels he's got unfinished business with the Premier League, and were an approach to be made, that's a gig that Thomas Tuchel would love to take. He wants to be back in the Premier League. He wants to be at a big club. He wants to be in a project that allows him to focus almost exclusively on the football side. It's a good fit as far as Tuchel is concerned. From Manchester United's point of view, though, they've not gone to Tuchel yet. They've not pre-interviewed Tuchel yet in case they wish to make a change. That's not how Ineos want to work. So the big question is, do Manchester United, if a vacancy comes, want to go to Tuchel as a front runner, or might they have questions about why it hasn't worked at Bayern and why it didn't work at Chelsea? And that's where other candidates may win more points at this point, formative stages, if a change is to be made, because Graham Potter was shortlisted for Nice a few years ago and has been on Ineos's radar for quite some time. So they know a bit more about Potter, the personality, Potter, the strategist, away from just CV as a manager. Whereas on the flip side, Potter couldn't handle Chelsea. Tuchel won the Champions League with Chelsea, so you can argue it both ways. Zinedine Zidane will likely make the long list within succession planning. We know about Gareth Southgate. He's had a previous relationship with Dan Ashworth through the FA, so you would expect him to be spoken about internally. But at this stage, none of these names, whether they want the gig or don't want the gig, have actually been approached, because first and foremost, they have to definitively decide on Ten Hag.
And this is something that I was going to reference because myself personally, and as an outlet in Theatre of Red, we are vocally supportive of Ten Hag remaining as manager. It's not trying to give a pardon for perceived lack of tactical setup, for, as you've made reference to, players looking like they're lethargic or essentially downing tools and that he's unable to get the best out of them. But it's more so recognition of the amount of variables that have affected him over the course of this year. Another thing that really, really stands out to me, and you make reference with regards to succession planning, and Brighton is a fantastic example, obviously, and a certain man that we will discuss later on, obviously, has a lot to play with that too. We know that with Sir Jim Ratcliffe coming in and desiring a best-in-class setup, a style of football that he wants Manchester United to play, and that ultimately will have a head coach be in that position that can implement this strategy, can implement this style. And this is where the succession planning that you're making reference to comes. Obviously, with Brighton, you've got De Zerbi. If he was to depart, because only 12 months ago, obviously, we're looking at the likes of Real Madrid being linked with him, that you would like to think that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 managers that can come in and fulfill the priority that he has at Brighton. Now, in previous time at Manchester United, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, the writing was on the wall for several months. Jose Mourinho himself obviously came out and stated that the time was right for him to go. We're not getting any murmuring of that with Erik ten Hag. It's more so speculation and reporting that he can't stay. There's no way that they can keep him. Yet there's no murmurings that I'm getting or that I'm seeing elsewhere that are legitimately stating the club are looking past him. Instead, we're seeing links with Bayern Munich, that he would be a primary target to come in and to replace the outgoing Thomas Tuchel. So does that come as a surprise to you that there's so much speculation with Tuchel being vocal about wanting to come into Manchester United were it to be available, and also that Ten Hag has been linked with going to that monster of a job in Germany?
Of course, you would expect Thomas Tuchel to be more vocal when asked publicly about his future, and sources in and around Thomas Tuchel to be more vocal, because he's actively seeking work, whereas Ten Hag is in a job. So Ten Hag would like to succeed at Manchester United and stay at Manchester United, but ultimately, if come the end of the season they're 8th, then a decision has to be taken. And it's a very atypical situation, because what you have to understand is that most clubs, if they are stable in ownership and strategy, and by that I don't mean in any way Ineos are unstable, quite the opposite, I just mean they're new. So stability comes over time, and whether you succeed or fail, you can have stability. Newcastle United had stability under Mike Ashley, in the sense it was Mike Ashley and he had the same strategy and the same approach. It just wasn't very good for the football club. And then when PIF came in, they had instability, because by nature change is instability, but it's been positive change. So it's a transitional phase. And because this summer will be new sporting owners, even though Ratcliffe only has a minority stake, he's got full control over the sporting department. And because the summer hasn't happened, and because it's not going to be a one-window strategy, you can make an argument that Ten Hag, judged at the end of the season, is basically under the old regime and the old strategy and the old recruitment. And if he stays, he's under a new sporting direction, new people, new CEO, and a new strategy. So does that mean if he finishes outside of the European places this season, he deserves to have more time under this new project? Because everything that's come this season is really on the Glazers. Or do they decide that the manager's the problem, and to fulfill their new strategy, they need a new manager? And I think this is where it will be very difficult to judge, simply because it's quite hard coming in mid-season, which is why Sir Jim Ratcliffe wanted it done in May. It's quite hard to truly establish whether or not, if Manchester United finish 8th, which would be seen as failure, 7th, which would be seen as failure, don't win the FA Cup, which to an extent, even though they've reached the final, would be seen as failure. Is that on the Glazers, on the old regime, on the old strategy, on a player-led culture? And does that mean that Ten Hag has always been hampered since day one? And remember, if we speak about day one, we're actually speaking about Ronaldo overshadowing his arrival, forcing his way out of the club in a very public interview, and Ten Hag not knowing at one point, even though we have to be fair to Ronaldo and there were horrible personal reasons, so you can understand why Ronaldo deserves empathy and compassion, but nonetheless, Ten Hag was in the dark. Ten Hag was blindsided by the public interview that was done with Piers Morgan. So away from the very personal tragedy on the Ronaldo side that we need to separate and give empathy and sympathy for, Ten Hag still never had a relationship with Cristiano Ronaldo professionally from day one and didn't know when he was returning. And again, I stress, because we need to be sensitive, there were very personal and very valid reasons on the Ronaldo side. But separate to that is the very public interview he did about wanting to leave Manchester United. And Ten Hag was brand new. He was blindsided. So at that point, you can argue from day one, he was hampered. And then we've had the Sancho situation. We've had the Greenwood situation. We've had players that have been injured, players that were bought for him like Mason Mount that haven't been fully fit and haven't found their form, players out of position like Casemiro as a centre-back. So how much of this are we putting on Ten Hag? How much are we putting on the old regime? How much can be fixed by a new regime? And I think it all boils down to one key question that Ineos will understand, which is not necessarily league position, but this is just my view speaking to sources. The only question that will matter is, does Ten Hag have the dressing room or doesn't Ten Hag have the dressing room? And if there's a feeling that there is unity and the players like playing under Ten Hag, then there's no reason to think that Ineos and Ratcliffe and all of these other new people, by being also new themselves, won't give him more time. But if they feel that he doesn't have the dressing room and that cannot be mended, then coupled with an 8th place finish or a 7th place finish or a lack of an FA Cup, you probably do have to make a change. And I think that is just football. But if a change is made, then the difference, if it is because of that particular aspect, is I think Ineos will not settle for saying new manager, same old, that will mend things. I think Ineos will say we cannot have a situation again where the dressing room can be that powerful, where the dressing room can have that much influence. And unfortunately, you can have a transition where sometimes you have to appreciate what you've inherited and deal with it. But going forwards, Ineos are thinking best in class in every area. And I don't think they feel like player power is a recipe towards long-term success. So whether it's Ten Hag or whether it's a new manager, the ability to have that authority and the ability to ensure that individual players or cliques of players can't keep defining what direction Manchester United go in as a football club will be something that's high on the list of priorities for Ineos to sort out and understand. And maybe they'll feel it doesn't exist, but it did in the past. Maybe they'll feel it does exist and it's a problem. I don't think we can judge at this point. And that's maybe the only thing in Ten Hag's favour, that he's being reviewed at the same time as those running Manchester United Football Club are still learning on the job and determining what needs to be changed. And because it's a work in progress, they may feel that stability is the best pathway towards success rather than changing manager, which is something Manchester United have tried several times in the past. And there's not that many examples, unfortunately, post Sir Alex Ferguson, where it's worked.
Well, we speak about change, and you've obviously referenced the best-in-class setup that is desired in the background. And this is what a lot of people, including myself, will veer towards, that while there are numerous issues on the field, off the field, I think it's about, in the short term, prioritizing what those real issues need to be put in pecking order. Because ultimately, regardless of the date that Sir Jim Ratcliffe arrived and the date that all of these individuals are going to begin their work, it's not going to happen overnight. And really and truly, with so much gardening leave going on, it's going to take quite some time. That brings us to, we'll say, Jason Wilcox. All right, he's arrived as the club's new sporting director. And we've got Jean-Claude Blanc keeping the seat warm for Omar Barada, who's obviously on garden leave ahead of his arrival as a new chief executive. When we look at this best-in-class setup that we are anticipating and moving forward, the name of Dan Ashworth has dragged on, obviously, for quite some time. Now, from my understanding, the key issue in this is related to the profit and sustainability rules, with a standoff over a projected compensation value between the two clubs. Given the information that you have and the sources you have, what can you tell us about this today, Ben?
Well, Dan Ashworth is a matter of time. It's been a case of when, not if, for months. It's just about the compensation and the start date. And once Newcastle in the next days, and I would say days is a possibility, or weeks, determine their own sporting director, then I would expect things to move very fast. So, as David Ornstein broke originally, it is true to my understanding that arbitration is on the table to get Dan Ashworth out of Newcastle, but that can be seen as a power play, and arbitration can disappear as quickly as it came along with a settlement, whether through lawyers or via the clubs directly, once Newcastle have their own sporting director candidate in place. Because naturally, once Newcastle, whenever that may be, because remember, the candidate Newcastle want may have a similar situation and a similar period of gardening leave. But once that sporting director is established and ultimately starts, Newcastle, with their own PSR concerns, are not going to be paying two sets of sporting director salaries to their new sporting director and Dan Ashworth, who will still receive his payment whilst he's on gardening leave because he's a member of Newcastle United Football Club. So I would expect this to resolve itself sooner rather than later. I think it's clear that Manchester United have always been prepared to wait. And I think it's obvious, and has been for quite some time, that they've never been prepared to pay this number around the 20 million mark. And the reason for that is because Manchester United are of the belief that no sporting director should be going for that kind of footballer's transfer fee. And if you look at in January, Newcastle and their desire, even though they didn't sell any of these players, to try to be open to be getting fees for Callum Wilson, maybe, even though it was denied at the time. I think at the right number, they would have entertained that. Or Miguel Almiron, who Al Shabab tried for and agreed something verbally with Newcastle, but the player didn't want to go. The valuation of those players, and Kieran Trippier, who Newcastle were adamant they didn't want to sell, but Bayern tried, the value for those players was 15 to 18 million. So you're in a situation where Dan Ashworth is more than Callum Wilson. Dan Ashworth is more than Miguel Almiron. Dan Ashworth is more than Kieran Trippier, which is, from Manchester United's point of view, ridiculous. And I have no issue with the Newcastle position, because if there's a clause, there's a clause. If there's a valuation, there's a valuation. So I also say fair play to Newcastle. So it's very easy as a Manchester United fan to think Newcastle are being difficult, but that is the reality. And that's brilliant from Newcastle's point of view because they're well protected. But you can understand why Manchester United are never going to pay that. And if they have to wait, they have to wait. So what's gone on, to my knowledge, is discussions not so much over this 20 million number, but what's it actually going to take to get Dan Ashworth not missing two windows and ideally starting on September the 1st? And is there a reasonable package in the millions, but the low millions, that will allow Ashworth to, number one, start after this summer, and number two, be able to plan for next summer and ideally be involved in January 2025? And when is that start date and what is that amount? And maybe, a bit like Richard Hughes going from Bournemouth to Liverpool, is there any, and this is a very underrated point, negotiation scope around the gardening leave, whereby he can still be on the gardening leave, he can't do X, Y, and Z, like go out in the market, have a job title, have an email, take a formal meeting, but is there anything informal he's allowed to do? So Richard Hughes has not started at Liverpool, but was able to be a leading voice in the appointment of Arne Slot. And you can understand the differentiation between Hughes can't go out there and make a summer signing, but he can absolutely be part of the recruitment process for Arne Slot. And maybe Dan Ashworth can be part of internal meetings, but he can't be part of negotiations. So then you might have him involved before he starts, but not involved directly in transfers and negotiations. And I think that that will be part of the conversations and that will be factored into the compensation as well. But the bottom line here is that Ashworth is going to end up at Manchester United. Everyone knows that. It's a case of how much he'll cost and when he can start.
And I would imagine he'll be privy to one or two Zoom calls along the way, as you're making reference to.
it's not that covert. The clubs are very respectful, and it's the same with Omar Barada. There's things Barada can do, and there's things Barada can't do. And nobody's going behind people's backs. So people are saying Barada's involved in the succession planning, Barada's involved in the Wilcox appointment. Barada's only involved in stuff that's been pre-agreed with Manchester City, because they're rivals on the field, but actually that was a very respectful process. And I think Ratcliffe said that on record, that Manchester City and himself and the Glazers were very open and upfront, because you need that relationship. So there'll be nothing, despite speculation about Ashworth inputting to this, Ashworth inputting to that at this stage. He's not a Manchester United employee. There's been no agreement made. And if he did do anything covert and untoward at this stage, then Newcastle are going to dig in, and Newcastle are going to make sure that ultimately, if this isn't done by the book, then that is going to have repercussions. So I would expect Ashworth to be very professional, very respectful, and that's why he's passed it over to the lawyers. So he can be more bullish, he can be more maverick, he can try and force the issue and put pressure within legal guidelines, because now the lawyers are taking care of it. But I don't think with Barada, I don't think with Ashworth, if he is appointed but can't start immediately, which is the expectation, you're going to see anything covert, because it's just not within the guidelines of very, very strict terms. And you would naturally expect Newcastle to put a breach clause into any compensation package. So if Ashworth is going into the market before he's allowed to, or taking a meeting before he's allowed to, then you would expect that to come with legally punishable financial terms that's in nobody's interest. So don't expect it to be coy and covert. I think this has to be done by the book.
Even when it is done, which is surely a matter of time, as you're saying, one of the largest briefs across the board is going to be overseeing a smooth transfer policy, which we have obviously touched upon. Now, there's going to be various incomings, various outgoings. And with that, the performances of Casemiro have been taking a regular talking point this season, particularly after Crystal Palace, with the 32-year-old looking like a spent force for much of the campaign. He has been injured, so I think a lot of people need to take that into consideration, as well as the fact that he is being played out of position. So I don't say any of this disrespectfully, because his accomplishments are second to none, and it was little over 12 months ago that he was receiving awards for inclusion in the FIFA Men's World 11, and a lot of people have forgotten this. But earlier today, I've seen multiple sources have now stated that Al Nassr are ready to submit a bid of around 40 million euros to acquire his services in the summer. You're going to get a lot of speculation, because obviously paper will never refuse ink. And Manchester United is obviously the most clickable source on the internet. But from what you have gathered on the ground yourself, or what you have heard, Ben, would you hold much credence in those links with Casemiro?
Yes, in the sense that I can confirm firsthand that Casemiro has been a Saudi target for quite some time, and Rafa Varane as well. But obviously with Varane, unless there's a reduced terms deal, the Saudis don't really need to negotiate with Manchester United. They need to negotiate with Varane. But with Casemiro, he's well contracted at Manchester United, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's 2027. So the club would expect a fee. But my understanding is that it will be about getting the wages off the wage bill. So if Casemiro wants to go to Saudi Arabia, John Murtagh, even though it's kind of part of the old regime, had already said in the earlier part of the year to the centralised Saudi deal makers that the fee is not going to be anything astronomical. Clearly, the more Manchester United can get, the better. But I don't expect them to dig in, because it's equally as important to get those wages off the books. So I'm told the fee, from the Saudi point of view, Manchester United may have other ideas, won't be as high as 40 million euros. I think you're looking at 25 to 30 million euros. But of course, there might be a few bonuses on top of that. But I think Manchester United would see 30 million euros plus bonuses as decent business. And the club, because these Saudi deals are atypical, is often decided last. So it's actually Al Hilal who have had the historical interest in Casemiro, but maybe they'll look at the last few months at Manchester United and feel that they want someone a bit more box to box with a bit more energy. Casemiro's energy levels have just dipped. He doesn't come across as a destroyer anymore. The intelligence is there, and the pace of the Saudi Pro League is less. I think Todd Bowley made a really good point in an interview with Sportico a couple of days ago, where he said in the Premier League you have to think and run, and in Serie A, Kalidou Koulibaly, who's now in Saudi Arabia, which is why I tell this story, had said you're able to think then run, but the Premier League you have to think and run. And I think the think and run aspect and the fact he's been played out of position and hasn't had that much protection has worked against Casemiro at Manchester United. But he could very easily go to Saudi, where he's able to think, then run, or think, then pass, or think, then shoot, and be in a position where he actually looks a very good player once again. And Koulibaly is definitely finding that, whereas he was under a bit of scrutiny at Chelsea as well. So Casemiro to Saudi from the Saudi side, big target, top target. I think the fee will be 30 million or 25 million euros plus bonuses on a 3-year contract. But it's all whether Casemiro wants to go, because he's got a cushy gig at Manchester United. And maybe, like some players we've seen, he wants that money, he wants that lifestyle. He's happy enough being a diminished squad player. So the only advantage Saudi have got is usually when we talk about players staying beyond their welcome, very loosely speaking, is that they do it because they like the city, they like the money. But obviously, Saudi can offer you Son and Saudi can triple your wage. So that might be a selling point. But the thing we're waiting on is whether Saudi are able to strike a deal with Casemiro. They'll have no problem striking a deal with Manchester United. It might be Al Hilal, it might be Al Nassr. There's no doubt it will be one of the PIF-controlled clubs. But at this stage, it's about central deal makers trying to strike first a deal with Manchester United, then seeing if Casemiro is interested, and then determining the club. And it doesn't make the blindest bit of difference if it's Al Hilal or Al Nassr, because they're both in Riyadh.
And sticking on that topic, we've seen multiple reports as well in the past couple of weeks that the club will consider offers for the vast majority of the squad, bar Kobbie Mainoo, Alejandro Garnacho, Rasmus Højlund. Although Erik ten Hag has rubbished this in his interview with Gary Neville during the week, given the real possibility that United may be looking at a campaign without European football, this is something we were discussing earlier today. Do you view this as a massive dent in any summer transfer plans for United moving forward?
Not necessarily. Obviously, it's a lure, but so's Manchester United. And anybody that wants to join Manchester United will know what a fantastic club and fan base it is. So no European football for one season. I don't think Chelsea, without European football, missed out on too many of their targets because of that. It was other considerations. And the biggest thing I think that's going to be a roadblock to Manchester United and targets is the fact that PSR and financial constraints coupled with no European football is a recipe for not being able to spend 200, 250 million in an inflated market, which might be what you need for all of your targets. So I think the finances are a bigger consideration than targets not wanting to join Manchester United just because there's no European football, because come be a hero at Manchester United and get them European football, and then spend 5 to 7 years at the football club succeeding and playing European football. Anyone that says for one season I'm not picking Manchester United solely because they've not got European football, I don't think is the right kind of profile. Because what you want is a player that understands they're walking into one, if not the biggest football club in the world. And if you can't get excited by that just because there's one season without European football, then go and play somewhere else, in my opinion. Now, there may be marginal decisions where it's Manchester United plus another suitor. And because that other suitor's got Champions League, they can pay more wages, they can pay more everything, including fee. And then you're at a disadvantage. But that's a combination of things. It's the fact that someone else can pay more wages. It's the fact someone else can pay a bigger transfer fee. So then as an indirect result of no European football, you lose that battle. But if Manchester United come calling to a player and they're the only suitor at a club with European football, and Manchester United don't have European football, but it's still a step up because it's Manchester United, it's Premier League. And the player says, no, it's all right, I'll stay at, with respect, your Napolis, your Romas, your Leverkusens, brilliant clubs, by the way, and Leverkusen have had the most phenomenal season. But if they're saying no solely on those grounds, then I think you say thank you very much and you move on and you find a character that relishes the chance to be part of a new era, a new culture, maybe a new manager, and go and restore the glory days. And I think that's the kind of character, whether homegrown or foreign, that Manchester United will be looking for. But the challenge is in this inflated market, how do they find the budget? And much like last summer, they had 80 to 100 million to bring in 2 early players. And I think it will be the same this summer. So last summer it was Mason Mount, Andre Onana, and I think heading into this summer it will be something very similar. Maximum 80 to 100 million to buy 2 players, and the rest will be contingent on outgoings. Then is every player or nearly every player for sale? Well, no, I don't think so, because Højlund's not for sale, Mainoo's not for sale. There's no guarantee now McTominay's not for sale, although maybe for the right offer. Garnacho's not for sale. I think that players like Wan-Bissaka, it would have to be a very, very good offer, but the player might dig in. Is Maguire now for sale? Well, only if you find somebody first. And again, it's the right move for the player. So I think we've got categorizations. Most players that are over the age of 29 are probably for sale at the right number. Some players are for sale or will leave anyway, Martial, Varane. And then in addition to that, I think there's that grey area of only if something exceptional came in. So Rashford just signed a new deal, is committed to this new project. But if someone wants to make a 80 to 100 million offer, then it might be too good to turn down. But that doesn't mean you're transfer listing them. And what we have to understand is that Manchester United want a striker, maybe a wide, creative-minded player, which is where Elise comes in. And then if it is Casemiro to go, or if it is Eriksen to go, a central midfielder, likely a left-sided one. If it is Maguire and or Varane to go, a centre-back, and they probably want a centre-back anyway, and they want a left-back as well. So how do you do striker, winger like Elise, central midfielder, centre-back and left-back for 100 million in an inflated market? You can't. You need 200 million, 250 million. And that's where the 100 million in outgoings go. So people always ask me about a player, but clubs like Manchester United in this window are going to be looking collectively and collaboratively, and they might move away from Elise because that's too much of their budget and they need 5. So everything is going to be weaved together, and that's ultimately where Wilcox is going to be particularly important, and so is Barada, and so is Jean-Claude Blanc. And it's sort of a strange one because I would classify Elise as a priority target, but not a priority position. So what direction do you go in? Do you go for the priority target and say, great, we've started with a wide player, but now we're worried because we can't go and get a box office striker at 90 million because we've just dropped 65 million on Elise, and we need to save 30 million for a central midfielder and 40 million for a centre back and 15 million for a left back. So you might want Elise, but you might say, you know what, we're actually going to try and find a cheaper winger like Crescencio Somerville at 45 million, and that might allow us to bring in Sesko and a centre-back and a central midfielder, each at 45 and 45 million. And that might mean João Gomez can come, or that might mean Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall can come. So it's a balancing act. So everyone always wants this clarity, but that's not how the window works. It's spinning plates, it's unreliable. And people will say, well, how do I get my headline for social media? Or how do I get my black and white? Manchester United want Elise. Manchester United are confident on Elise. And if you put your eggs in that basket, you might be true. But I look at it with many years of experience, knowing that if they go for Elise, it will probably mean that they can't enter the conversation for 2 of their other box office targets because they're not going to be able to spend 250 million in this first window. Even with 100 million in outgoings, I would say United are probably going to spend 200 million max, and even that's ambitious. So do the maths yourself. Like when you pick your fantasy league team and you put, let's just pick a Manchester United player, even though all the expensive players are Manchester City ones, you put Haaland and Bruno Fernandes in your team, and you're like, now I've got to build a squad, and I've already eaten into 25% of my budget, and I still need to add another 15 or whatever it is players. Do the maths yourself. Try and come up with 5 players at, let's just call it 150 million, or if we're being really generous, 200 million. And start with Michael Elise at 65 million, and then add whoever your striker of chosen choice is, whether it's Sesko at 60 million because the release clause has gone up, whether it's Victor Gyökeres at 70 million quid, whether it's Victor Osimhen at 100 million. But whatever it is, play the game yourself and go Elise plus striker of your choice and see how much money you've left with. And then try and tell me you can find a central midfielder, a centre-back and a left-back. Because I guarantee you're only left with about 20 million quid. Or you might have to say, I'm going to have to commit to my wide player at max 40, 45, because even though Elise is a priority target, that's not the priority position. Then you go and spend your 70, 80 million on a striker, your 50 million on a central midfielder, and you might still have the budget to add a 30 or 40 million winger, a 20 to 40 million centre back, and a young left back at 10 million quid. And it might just be doable, but it's still probably coming to 150 to 200 million quid. So it's difficult, is the point that I'm making. So there will be priority names, but not all of them will be in the priority positions. And it may be they start positionally first. And that might mean one or two of the names we're hearing at the moment fall down in the pecking order, even though in an ideal world, Manchester United would love to have.
I think a lot of what you just said is very interesting because it stems back to what Sir Jim Radcliffe obviously set out in his mission statement, that he was asked about the likes of Mbappe. And he said that he didn't want to purchase Mbappe, he wanted to purchase the next Mbappe. That is what we should be doing. We should be producing footballers. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on with you, and it's down to Elise that you just mentioned. It's not whether I think you think he's going to be purchased by Manchester United. It's more so looking at the player himself, because it's something I covered in the last couple of days. Yes, he's a tremendous talent, amazing footballer, and you said he is a primary name, not necessarily a primary position. But since 2021, this is a guy who has missed over 200 days of football through injury, with about 195 of those coming through hamstring injuries. So given the season that Manchester United have had with 60 plus individual injuries and the physio complaints that we have on a weekly basis, I'm asking you directly as a football supporter, do you think that is the type of signing that Manchester United should be making?
It's just due diligence, isn't it? To understand where a player's injuries have come from and if you can prevent them in the future. And that's one thing I expect Ratcliffe and his team to get right, because this cultural revamp is also a data revamp. It's a medical department revamp. So everyone's focusing on Ten Hag, but actually the reality is every single, and just for the sake of it as manager, I'm calling Ten Hag the football head, but every single head of department and every single department is under review. So it's not just Ten Hag that's having an end of season review, the medical department, the data department, the analytics department. And part of what Ratcliffe wants to understand, as well as why break rooms are messy at a very micro detail level, is why the injuries have happened and can they be prevented? And if they can, then they may feel that whoever they sign can have a better record and play more minutes. And it might be minutes management, it might be prevention, it might be better recovery techniques, it might be calls on when they're integrated after recovering from an injury, or as you've just said, they may be put off a player because they might seem like the right profile, but there may be something there that says, hang on a minute, for what we're paying, it's not a good investment. And if you look at Antonio Nusa at Club Bruges, there was an agreement there with Brentford, but they backed out of it after the medical, even though he's a top talent. And even though most believe that he'll be able to have longevity as a player and that his back and knee injuries are not a problem, Brentford said, you know what, for that amount of money, we can't go through with this because we've uncovered problems. So it's about playing the odds. And when you play the odds, you preempt and you're proactive and you react. So the proactive stuff is, what do we need to spend on the medical department? How can we sync the medical department with data? How can we manage minutes? How can we get a manager on board that's prepared to manage minutes? So if the medical department say 60 minutes and you're 1-0 down and you've got Elise on the field or whoever it is, Ten Hag may say, I want to push it to 70. But you have to buy into the model and say that extra 10 minutes might cost me 6 months of Elise if he does his hamstring at that point. So this is where the connectivity, and it's quite like a boring thing to say because everyone just wants Elise, great signing, excitement, goals, win the league. But it's that connectivity between departments. And the amount of managers I know when they buy into this, Thomas Frank's a good example, Pochettino at Chelsea, the manager may get slated for taking off a player. And then you may find out in hindsight that it was always the plan, that an hour is the max that player can play. And you may not know that player was carrying something. So that's the connectivity. And you might not like it as a fan. And you might say, doesn't the manager have autonomy to trump it? But the manager's saying, the odds of this player pulling his hamstring in that extra 10 minutes are so high that we're not going to risk it, even if we need that player on the field. So it's synergy and it's respect. And sometimes the manager will throw his or her toys out the pram because they say, I need that extra 10 minutes. And sometimes they'll go against the medical department and they'll pick up an injury. And sometimes they'll go against the medical department and they'll score the winner. And they'll say, I've had the last laugh. So it's a balancing act. And the most important ingredient in all of this, in recruitment, in medicine, in analytics, is freedom to challenge. You don't want a load of yes men and women. You don't want an autonomy. You want people, not titles, people that have genuine, healthy freedom to challenge. And Liverpool have got that. And Chelsea are trying to develop that. And if you have that, then you're not always going to agree, but you're going to come to collaborative decisions with healthy debate. And that includes on injury. And that's where the proactive stuff is. The reactive stuff is in something has happened. Why has it happened? Is anybody to blame? Can we learn from it? And then how can we ensure the player recovers in the best possible way? And also, how can we ensure that when they have their rehabilitation, they're not brought back too soon? And none of this, by Ratcliffe standards, exists at a best-in-class level at Manchester United. But he wants it to over time. And if it does, then they might take a few more risks on players with injury records. And they'll also start to understand why this season there's been so many injuries. Is it down to training methods? Is it down to a lack of data? Is it down to minutes management not being done to correct protocol? And it's so hard, isn't it? Because if I'm saying reactively, you've pulled your hamstring, I'm going to limit your minutes to an hour max. Most would say, I'm okay with that. The player would say they're okay with it. The manager would say they're okay with it. The medical team would say they're okay with it. But what if I say to you, you're 21 years of age and you've had no injury issues, but my data says that you're putting more and more stress on games because you're covering more distance or you're going in for more tackles. And my feeling from the projections, which is often done using AI, is that in that last 20 minutes of games, you're tiring and you're more likely to pick up the following kind of injuries. And AI predicts that if we give you 7 straight games at 90 minutes, in one of those 7 games at 90 minutes, if you cover that distance or you have that amount of duels or you win that amount of headers, whatever it is, because I can promise you top run clubs are running all these simulations almost as if it's a game. The data may come back completely hypothetically, and it may say there's a 20% chance extra that this player is going to pick up an injury. And this is what Liverpool are doing. They're running it like a game of Football Manager. And then you're presenting that. And how high up the pyramid do you give that data? Because you don't want paralysis by analysis. But they're running these hypothetical models. And at some point, they may say there's a pattern. And we want the manager to know, and we want the medical staff to know. And first it will go to the medical staff, and the medical staff may say there's an anomaly here, or it's irrelevant, or you're not factoring in X, Y, or Z. Or the medical staff may say, yeah, that's really interesting. Now let's do a preventative scan. And actually we realize that the player's not at 100%, they're only at 98%. They may go back to the manager and they may say, you need to do things differently, and you need to make sure you take this player off. Or you may not play this player on a Sunday and then a Wednesday. And it may seem farcical to the fan because there may be literally nothing there other than a simulation or a model or data or a scan you don't know about. But it may result in that player not playing back-to-back games or not playing 3 games or not playing 4 games. And if you think about it, and I know we've gone off on a complete tangent here, but I personally think it's quite interesting. If you think about workload for a player, we're thinking about it on a Sunday to a Wednesday or 3 games in a week. But we're not really thinking about a month or 2 months. No manager says, we're playing once a week and actually my players is too much for them. But if you're only looking at physical impact plus training, it might be. And something might be coming up there in the data room, in the simulation room, in the leadership team, which is strategy, on the training ground, which is football, in the medical room, or a combination of everything that leads them for whatever reason to believe that player X can't play this week. And player X may say, but I'm healthy, but I'm fit. And the manager may say, this is ridiculous. And eventually the healthy debate will take place, and one department, football department, the player side, the medical side, the data side, the leadership side, someone will win. And there's obviously a process for who eventually votes on it and who decides. And it's frustrating because it's speculative when you act proactively. So you either have to trust that the data pays off over time, so it's not so speculative because the proof's been in the pudding, and you trust that they're not just giving you hypotheticals, and that over time the approach will lead to less injuries. But it's difficult because if you've got a big game and you need to beat Arsenal, you need to beat Newcastle, you also want your best players. And if they say they're fit, then how can you go against that? So this is the freedom to challenge. And this is the thing you don't see day on day at clubs. And this is what leads to decision making. But if you're not connected, then guess what? Erik ten Hag, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, Jose Mourinho are making all the decisions. And if the players get injured, there's some 21-year-old genius from Oxford University that's got an amazing maths degree that's sitting there pulling their hair out saying, I've had simulations that told you all 60 of these injuries would happen. And if you'd have only listened to me, then you might have only had 20 injuries for the season. But he's not speaking to Ten Hag. It has to go up, up, up the hierarchy, up the system, and someone higher than him or her has to decide, is this going to be shared? Isn't this going to be shared? So connectivity and freedom to challenge are two really vital attributes that never get spoken about in the public domain, but are absolutely paramount if Manchester United are to improve as a project.
How fitting that you discuss this on the day that Lisandro Martinez and Marcus Rashford have been pictured back in first team training at Carrington. With that, Ben, we shall call time on this week's chat. Let you fly back to the footballing world that consumes so much of your time. Of course, thank you so much for spending the time today, and we can touch base hopefully ahead of the new season to discuss what I'm sure is going to be a very, very interesting pre-season for Manchester United. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, look forward to it. Congratulations on the launch of your podcast. Number 1 has sent everybody to sleep, so it's onwards and upwards from here. Georgie, call you the Belfast boy. Georgie, call you the Belfast boy. They say, Georgie, keep on the call. Georgie, won't you listen to the song? Georgie, put a lead in the name. Play the game.
The Theatre of Red is available across all social networks at theatre_of_red. And you can catch all of your daily Manchester United news at the website theatre-of-red.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you all next week.